Hey, we're on the Uni1 channel. And today we have a podcast with the founder and CTO, Alexei Kachalov. And we're going to talk about why almost half of all email newsletters in the world end up in spam and what can actually be done about it. Let's go.
Hey,
Let's quickly go through the top questions that our clients ask most often, as well as those who are just getting into the world of email newsletters. Let's do it in a blitz format, answers up to 30 seconds. First question, what's the current situation with spam in email marketing?
well, overall, anywhere from 20 to 50% of emails can be rejected or marked as spam. And actually, even legitimate mailings can have deliverability issues because of low engagement, configuration errors, or outdated mailing lists.
Oh, that sounds pretty serious. So, what would you say are the top 5 reasons emails end up in spam?
Well, first of all, it's block lists or blacklists and spam traps that cause emails to end up there. Secondly, it's probably technical issues like errors in SPF, DKIM, DMARC, not following the requirements of mail services, then low engagement of the mailing list and its hygiene. Fourthly, this is probably close to the first point about block lists, but still, it probably makes sense to highlight it separately. This is IP reputation or domain reputation. Fifthly, these are individual spam filters of recipients. Even so, your email might be labeled as spam.
Yeah. Interesting. Out of all these points, it seems like the most controversial one is about engagement and list hygiene, right? In your experience, how often should you actually clean your subscriber list?
By cleaning, you mean removing inactive subscribers, right? In my opinion, this should be done at least once a year, so at least once a year, but ideally even every 6 months. Some especially meticulous people do this every 3 months.
And if it happens that your emails start landing in spam, on average, how long does it take to restore the domain's reputation?
Well, it can take weeks or even months. Sometimes, honestly, it's easier to just get a new domain and warm it up. But of course, it's cheaper and better to just regularly take care of the reputation of the domain you already have.
Yeah. And probably the most common question, can certain words in the subject or content of an email cause it to end up in spam?
These days, almost never. Now, spam filters pay more attention to engagement and reputation, not specific words.
Thanks for the informative blitz. Now, let's take a deeper look at all these questions. So, why is it that despite technological advances and the huge variety of services, email deliverability is still such a big problem in the industry?
Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, email providers and anti-spam filters have gotten smarter, and now they analyze a ton of parameters. They look not only at whether the content is relevant and that there's no obvious spam in the message, but also at recipient behavior. And on top of that, there's just more spam now. Spammers are getting smarter, anti-spam filters are getting smarter, and this, in some way, affects legitimate senders too.
And these anti-spam filters you mentioned, yeah, they're often called blacklists too, right? So what exactly are they? Why are they unpleasant or dangerous for senders, and how do you actually deal with them?
Blacklists, also commonly known as block lists, are fundamentally comprehensive lists of untrustworthy, potentially malicious IP addresses or suspicious domains, and they are typically widely distributed for free public access and utilization. Any email provider can use them and refuse to accept emails from senders that are listed there. There are various reasons you might end up on one. It could actually be spam, even from legitimate senders, or it might be a configuration error, or a sudden change in usual behavior, volume, frequency, or recipients. But overall, they serve a good purpose, even though they can cause difficulties. Their main goal is to clean up the email ecosystem as a whole. The thing is, unlike messengers, for example, email is an open ecosystem. Anyone can get in and take advantage of its benefits, But that also creates certain challenges. It's kind of like a forest, it's a self-cleaning system. But there are forest rangers, and their job is basically to prevent those who disrupt the ecosystem from multiplying.
That's an interesting comparison. So, if I understand correctly, just like forest rangers, they also use their own tools to catch, let's say, troublemakers or dishonest hunters. What is the most common tool they use?
Well, we can't avoid talking about spam traps here. A spam trap is a special email address that doesn't have an owner, or whose owner never subscribed to any mailing lists. These spam traps are managed by the block lists themselves. If they see that you're sending emails to such an address and, God forbid, you do it repeatedly, then they understand that you're sending spam. This could be an address specifically registered by the block list itself and not subscribed to anything. If you handle your address database incorrectly, exchange addresses with someone, or God forbid buy them, or even just collect email addresses through a subscription form without verifying them, you might end up hitting a spam trap and seriously hurt your deliverability in the future.
What would you say are the top 3 recommendations to avoid falling into these spam traps?
Well, the best approach, though unfortunately not always feasible for business reasons, is to verify subscribers' email addresses using so-called technologies or confirmed opt-in. This is when, in response to a subscriber wanting to leave their email, you send a unique link to that address, and by clicking it, they confirm that the address is really theirs and that they genuinely want to subscribe. Without this kind of verification, a subscriber might intentionally or accidentally leave someone else's email or an incorrect email, which could turn out to be a spam trap. Even if the subscriber is completely legitimate and attentive, they might make a mistake, for example, in the domain name. And block lists can easily buy up domains with typos, registering them for themselves, especially when they see that you're not verifying email addresses. This is the first and most important thing you could do. Besides that, as we mentioned earlier, you need to take care of the hygiene of your contact list, your subscriber list. Clean it from inactive addresses. If, for some reason, double opt-in or confirmed opt-in subscriptions aren't available, then you need to take other measures. Well, for example, at the very least, protect yourself from bots. Add a special captcha to the subscription form to filter out attempts at automated sign-ups. In addition to all of this, you should also carefully consider that inactive subscribers, if you absolutely do not want to drastically shrink your valuable mailing list by simply cutting off those individuals who do not actively engage with your content, can actually respond quite well to thoughtfully designed reactivation campaigns and strategies. When you specifically ask to confirm your interest in your mailings by clicking on a link, you will know that this is really a subscriber who wants to receive your emails.
Yeah, right. So, am I understanding correctly that, besides the importance of verifying new addresses, spam traps can also be hidden among old collected addresses, even if they were valid at one point, but haven't been used for some time? That's actually why periodic reactivation and verification are necessary, right?
Yes, that's an interesting and important point. The thing is, the address a subscriber used to contact you, or the address they left a year, 2, or even 3 years ago, could very well become abandoned after some time. An email address that hasn't been actively used for a year or even more is often considered to be inactive or non-working by the mailbox provider, and that specific address might either be taken over by someone else, or sometimes this is done quite intentionally. In other words, an inactive address that doesn't respond to anything shouldn't be sent to, among other reasons because it can turn into a spam trap, even if it was active before. Oh. And yes, that's one of the reasons for hygiene, so you don't send to inactive addresses.
That's an important point. Okay. You also mentioned technical settings like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Could you please tell us in more detail why they're important and where senders most often make mistakes, and what issues with deliverability that can cause?
Well, email has a long history of development, and the point we're at now is the result of a series of complementary technologies that both hinder spammers and, on the other hand, help legitimate senders. And SPF, DKIM, and DMARC are such technologies, and, well, they're not exactly trivial to set up. There really is room for mistakes. For example, marketers sometimes forget that there should only be one SPF and one DMARC record per domain. If you add a second one, it's unclear which one the recipient server will use. And if this turns out to be an incorrect entry, your letters may be considered spam. But DKIM, for example, on the contrary, allows you to enter several records with different selectors. That is, you can have multiple signatures. Yes, DKIM is an electronic signature of a letter, but first, you need to choose the right signature when sending. And secondly, when setting up DKIM, people often forget that subdomains should have their own signatures. And subdomains can also have their own sending. Moreover, in large companies nowadays, different departments can handle emails differently, and there can be situations, for example, when two departments send from the same domain, but the SPF record only includes the IP addresses of one server, and they forgot to add the second one. And in this case, there's a risk of emails being marked as spam.
Yeah.
It's incredibly important not to just set up a record once and then completely forget about it, assuming that it will always work smoothly and efficiently without encountering any unforeseen issues or problems whatsoever. We recommend checking this periodically, and in particular, at UniOne and Celsi, our service automatically monitors this for you. If it detects any incorrect settings, and sometimes a domain administrator forgets or changes something, which causes the record to become invalid, whether it's an SPF, DKIM, or DMARC record. So, our service monitors this and automatically notifies you about any issues and suggests how to fix them. People use these kinds of regular checks.
Yeah, I think it's much more useful than keeping track of all these things manually, especially when we're talking about companies with lots of different departments and senders. By the way, we were talking about subdomains and signatures. So, in general, what's the policy on using subdomains for senders? How important is it to have several of them for different types of mailings? Or, if there aren't that many emails being sent, you can just send everything from one address. Like, for example, info@company.com.
Well, generally, companies usually have at least two types of emails. Those are bulk promotional or marketing emails and informational transactional emails, which are usually personalized.
Right.
Of course, it's recommended to separate these two streams. This allows mailbox providers and email services to more accurately assess and not mix the reputations of these two streams. In this case, even if one of your marketing campaigns, for example, gets rejected by the email provider on suspicion of spam, at least it won't affect your transactional mailings, which are usually more critical and sensitive to being blocked. And you can separate them precisely through subdomains. You can create different third-level domains for transactional and marketing mailings. You can even split them into more streams if needed. Maybe you have several types of marketing or several types of transactional mailings. This way, you reduce the risk of all your traffic being blocked. Also, by the way, if possible, it's recommended to separate them by IP addresses as well. It's no secret that a sender's reputation is made up of several factors. Both the domain reputation and the IP reputation contribute with different weights, and it's important that this technical aspect is separated whenever possible. If you can't separate by IP or domain, it still makes sense to send different types of emails from different sender addresses at the very least.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking about the technical side from the sender's infrastructure perspective, we basically have two important variables that affect reputation: the reputation of the domain and the sending IP. Overall, if we look at the first part, yes, the domain reputation. And it just so happened that, unfortunately, the emails started ending up in spam. What steps can we take to restore our reputation, get our emails out of spam, and ensure they reach recipients?
Well, first of all, of course, you need to run diagnostics and an audit. What kind of content are you sending? What are the technical parameters? Is everything set up correctly? Secondly, as part of this audit, you need to understand how you interact with your audience. If you have old addresses or inactive addresses, What I mean is, you probably can't really talk about restoring the reputation of the domain itself here. It's more about just normalizing the way your mailings work. Whether it's directly related to the domain, the IP address, or something else, that's not so important. What's important is to understand exactly what you're doing wrong. Well, to start with, after these diagnostic steps, I would recommend segmenting your contact list and, for a while, sending only to your most active and engaged subscribers. And be careful to avoid any provocative or overly irritating advertising content. It might seem obvious, but that's really the best approach. And over time, as email providers see that your subscribers are responding positively to your emails, pulling them out of spam, clicking, viewing, you can start to expand the audience you target with your mailings. There are also technical measures, of course. For example, if we're talking about the IP address, although this also applies to the domain, you should probably check how long you've been sending from this domain. Maybe you ignored the warm-up rules and immediately started sending large volumes of mailings from a new domain or new IP address, which the email providers saw as suspicious behavior, and that's exactly why you got blocked. In that case, you need to roll back and start the warm-up process. That is, you should send in small batches, gradually increasing the size of your subscriber base.
That's an important point. But if we're talking about content, people still often ask if there are any trigger or forbidden words that could make email providers mark messages as spam, even when everything else is set up correctly.
I would say no. But there is a caveat. These days, it's not so much words that are a red flag, but rather links. So, if your content contains links to resources that are already on block lists, that alone can be enough reason for your email to be sent to spam. But overall, something else is more important now. Now, the recipient's reaction is more important. In many questionable cases, I'm not sure if you've noticed this or not, but mailbox providers, when they receive the first emails from a large mailing, after accepting them, don't always show these emails in the recipient's inbox for all recipients right away. They only show a small portion. Observe how recipients react, whether they open these emails or not, whether they manually mark them as spam or not. And only then do they decide what to do with the rest. So, basically, this means that, first of all, engagement is important for you, and secondly, if you have the opportunity to segment your mailing and send first to your most engaged subscribers, that could be a good solution. Regarding the content, it just needs to inspire trust. And I don't think there's any point in trying to tailor it specifically for spam filters. Spam filters are pretty smart these days, and trying to trick them by avoiding certain words or adding specific words is quite difficult. It seems like you just need to adapt to your audience. In other words, write content that is relevant and useful for your audience, and worry less about trigger words. It'll work out.
That is indeed a truly great recommendation to effectively wrap up this important section on diligently maintaining and carefully building your domain's overall reputation. Regarding the second important element, the reputation of sending IP addresses, is that so? How exactly do these factors profoundly affect email deliverability? And what proactive steps can email senders truly take to make absolutely sure their important emails, are fully and completely compliant so that they ultimately end up in the correct and intended folders and not, under any circumstances, in the dreaded spam folder?
Well, overall, as I mentioned, reputation depends on both the domain and the IP address. With the IP address, the situation is that usually the sender, the client of the email service provider, can't really influence the IP address much, especially if it's a shared IP address used by many ISP clients. And here's what you can do in this situation. First of all, if your budget allows, it makes sense to get a dedicated IP address. Even if you're using a shared infrastructure from some ISP, there's usually an option to purchase a dedicated IP address there. At the very least, then you alone will be responsible for the IP address's reputation, and no one else will be able to affect it. But overall, it's important to keep an eye on whether this IP address appears in any block lists. And if for some reason it does show up there, you need to take timely action to get the address delisted. That is, contact the blocklist provider, explain the situation, and state why you believe it's a mistake and request that the address be removed. Sometimes this can be tricky, but if you're working with an ESP, at Unione we also provide these kinds of services. You can ask your ESP to handle this for you. And probably, your chances of success will be higher, since the specialists know how to present the case in the best way. Sometimes they ask users to do it themselves, sometimes they handle it for you, and sometimes it has to be done through the provider, depending on how serious the situation is. So yes, the only real recommendation here is to regularly monitor the situation. By the way, at Unione we send automatic notifications if your IP addresses get blocked, so you'll always know if something unusual happens that needs your attention, and you can respond to it in time.
That's really helpful. By the way, speaking of dedicated IP addresses, besides the fact that, yes, it's an extra paid service, is there anything else senders should know if they decide to go ahead and set up dedicated IPs? I mean, how is this different from using the standard shared IP pools?
Well, dedicated addresses, aside from the fact that physically it's a digital address different from all the addresses in the ESP's infrastructure or other senders, allow you to make additional configurations. Let's put it this way, it's a kind of branding for that IP address. So, you can assign a domain to this address that matches your main domain or, more precisely, one of its subdomains. Overall, when sending is done from a host that matches the sender's host, it earns you extra points.
Well, probably, based on what you mentioned earlier, in terms of content, like possible suspicious links in the email body. So, if the sender uses dedicated IP addresses and the emails are branded, then this also has a positive effect on the links as well. And if we talk about, in combination, about sending domains and dedicated IPs throughout the whole infrastructure, does the volume of mailings that the sender does at different stages of their business life and journey affect the likelihood that their mailings will end up in spam or not? Are there actually any differences in strategy for, say, startups just beginning their journey, and large corporations that have been building their recipient lists for years?
Yes, absolutely. The volume of mailings does affect the likelihood of ending up in spam. And there are several important points here that need to be taken into account. First of all, if a mailbox provider or a block list sees a sudden change in the behavior of a sender sending emails from a certain IP address, they consider it very suspicious. And even though the emails themselves might be completely legitimate, the sender risks ending up on a block list or being sent to spam by the mailbox provider. The reasons are clear, because it's not uncommon for infrastructures to get hacked, and when emails start being sent to addresses that aren't usually targeted, or if there's a sudden spike in traffic, all these things trigger a response from the providers or block lists' anti-spam systems. And here an important process comes into play, which we call warming up. But if you, say, connect a newly assigned IP address, which we talked about recently, it's important not to switch all your traffic and immediately start sending everything from the new IP. You need to do this gradually over the course of several weeks. Every ESP, and Unione is no exception, should have such warming up procedures. With us, this process is automated, and you can be sure that when you add a dedicated IP, the warming up is monitored and carried out correctly. But aside from the actual warming up process itself, there can be several other significant influencing factors that play a role. And here, the differences in sending approaches for startups and large companies come down to the fact that for large companies, and generally for companies with a lot of traffic, things are easier. You could say that mailbox providers prefer big senders, and it's a bit more difficult for startups. And it seems this is one of the reasons why it's easier for startups to start sending not from their own server, but to begin working with some ESP, where everything is set up, controlled, and the overall volumes generally allow for a more positive response from providers.
Interesting. So you're saying that IP addresses definitely need to be warmed up? Is there a similar procedure for sending domains? For example, if for some reason the sender decides to change the domain or, say, launches a new site for a new project but has the same subscriber base. So what do you do in those cases? Can you just start sending the same newsletters from a new domain to your existing list without any risks?
There is a risk. I'd say, based on our experience, it's less than with IP addresses. But I wouldn't recommend switching all your traffic to the new domain at once. And even if you're doing it manually, it's better to start with small volumes when sending from new domains. And only over time, when you see that everything is working out with small volumes, should you start increasing the volume of mailings from the new domain. There are also issues related to domain reputation, and if this domain was registered recently, we generally don't recommend starting to send from it right away. So yes, warming up domains is also a sensible thing to do.
Are there any comprehensive and effective tools that allow you to thoroughly check or continuously monitor, the current reputation of various domains, specific IP addresses, and in a more general sense, what are the essential tools that truly help to significantly improve overall email deliverability performance?
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, I would recommend using so-called postmasters. Some major providers have their own services where you can register and monitor how emails with your signatures, that is, your emails, are delivered to your recipients, whether they end up in spam or the inbox, or maybe even get rejected as spam altogether. And that's a valuable source of information. Besides that, there are other tools as well. For example, there are services where you can subscribe to monitor your domain's reputation. If your ESP, for instance, doesn't notify you about issues in a timely manner. For example, they have a box. There are also many other subtle and intricate aspects related to technically correct and proper email sending, which are important to consider. And if you see a problem and your system administrator or your developer responsible for sending emails can't figure out what's wrong, there are special services that can let you check the entire email sending session. For example, we've created a free tool called smtpdebug.com where you can check how the sending process is going. In addition, there are services that let you see how well your email looks in different mailboxes, whether it's on a mobile phone, the web version of Outlook, or something similar, and there are plenty of other similar services out there. So yes, there are a lot of services. This is probably worth a separate discussion and a dedicated comparative review.
Yeah, I guess it's important to understand here that, just like with volumes, different tools might be suitable for different companies and different tasks. But it's interesting that you mentioned different email providers. Each one has its own postmaster to track domain reputation. And in general, each of them has different requirements for senders as well. So Gmail has its own, Outlook has its own, Yahoo has a third set, or is there something they all have in common?
Well, in general, these companies, the email providers, try to develop their own systems, and each has its own algorithm for processing emails. And that's why, of course, the requirements are different. There are a lot of overlapping requirements, but still, there are differences. For example, from our experience, we see that Gmail pays more attention to domain reputation and subscriber behavior. Outlook, on the other hand, focuses more on technical aspects and the reputation of the IP address. Specifically, if you're on the Spamhaus block list, it's unlikely you'll be able to deliver any emails to Outlook or Hotmail at all. For example, one of the recent changes is that in February of last year, Gmail and Yahoo jointly established new requirements for bulk senders, making it mandatory to publish a DMARC policy for all senders who send more than 5,000 emails per day. And by the way, Microsoft hasn't done this yet, but they're planning to do something similar this year, so right now, there are differences between them. Plus, various smaller-scale providers may impose their own restrictions and requirements. You can find this out from the documentation on their websites or simply by analyzing the sending and delivery logs.
So, basically, the main thing is to keep track of updates, right? That is, to know which email addresses we're sending messages to, what's in our lists, and to monitor their policies. And, yes, also to choose a reliable provider that meets all the current requirements. So, it looks like we've basically covered everything, at least the main points, right, of this iceberg when it comes to deliverability and avoiding the spam folder. To sum up, what would you advise every email marketer to do right now?
Check your lists and take care of their hygiene, review your settings, and make sure everything is technically set up correctly. But most importantly, take care of your subscribers' engagement. That means sending interesting and relevant content. Don't follow bad practices, don't buy lists, don't trade lists. That's a one-way ticket to the spam folder.
Yes, that's probably one of the most important points that still needs to be emphasized. Thank you very much, Alexei. And thank you, listeners, for being with us. Subscribe and give us a like. Don't forget to check your SPF records so your emails get delivered. And also, use SPF products personally, since summer is coming up, so everyone can be happy, healthy, and have a nice tan. That's all, thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.